He has gone out of his mind is not usually taken as a compliment. But let me do a little Greek lesson for you to help you understand what I think this gospel passage really is trying to get at. What gets translated in English as out of his mind literally means to stand outside oneself. And the Greek word is the word from which we get the word ecstasy. Jesus is in ecstasy. He has stepped outside of himself. He has stepped outside that small place where he began. You might want to look at that small place in the window furthest to the left here as you come up for your communion. That small slop trough in Bethlehem where he was born. He stepped out of that small place into something larger and larger and larger. God has called him to break through boundaries and barriers, not to live in a tiny little bounded slop trough, or even the tiny town where he grew up, Nazareth. The estimate is maybe 400 people. But God has kept asking him to break through all of that, to stand outside himself, to experience ecstasy. The ecstasy of knowing the love of God and seeing where that takes him. How did that happen to Jesus? What's the picture we have of Jesus moving from a small and bounded place into this ecstatic place? Well, for that picture, you might want to look at the third stained glass window there in the apse. At his baptism, it is said that the heavens were torn open, and the Spirit of God came and breathed into him. That thin place that separates God from us became thinner still in Jesus, so thin that we say Jesus was completely overtaken by God. God's heart, God's mind, God's love. We even say, if you want to know what God is like, look at Jesus. Jesus has been overtaken by the love of God and drawn out of his small beginning place into an ever bigger one, and we hear more about that today, as we will throughout this summer season of Pentecost. What about you? That Spirit that breathed into Jesus and called him to break from his tight, confined beginning place to ever bigger places of love, compassion, and action. That same Spirit has breathed into you, or you wouldn't be here today. You'd be home worshiping at St. Mattress and All Springs, as so many other people are. But something has broken through. Something has called you out of your narrower, smaller place of beginning to be here, to sit among people that you barely know, to risk the love of God, to risk compassion, to risk being called into action by hymns and prayers and, who knows, even maybe by my words. And for us to be broken free into that, all of us need the Spirit of God. Because otherwise we're trapped in a hiding place like our first parents, Adam and Eve, in that first story. We're in a fearful and hidden place where we stay away from God. Stay away from that love, that Spirit that will call us out, call us into a bigger place, call us literally to become out of our minds. So what's it like for this to happen? What's it like to be led out of a tiny place of beginning into a larger one? Well, the first thing to say is that many of us would rather stay in a fearful and hidden place because it feels pretty comfortable. I was born in a small town in West Virginia, and I lived very comfortably there for the first 9 years of my life. When my parents uprooted me at age 9 and began a series of moves to several different states over the next 5 years, I didn't like it one bit. I would have rather stayed comfortable and hidden in that little town in northern West Virginia. But I dare say if I hadn't been called out of that place, much against my will, if I had hidden there and been comfortable in the bushes of northern West Virginia, I doubt I'd be standing here. And I'm glad to be here. So what's it been like for you? What's it like to be called out of a smaller place into a larger one, to be called out of your mind into deeper love, deeper risk, less fear? Well, for these pictures, I'd like to offer you 3 illustrations. If you hear yourself in these illustrations, you're projecting, because these are all stories about friends of mine from Baltimore. But feel free to project away. The first: he was a gifted singer and a show-off. He liked being heard above all the other voices. He was perhaps the best voice in the choir, but he didn't know how to blend. He liked to show off. Until one day, a young boy joined the choir who had a cleft palate and who couldn't speak very clearly. And our show-off somehow began listening to the boy, wanting to hear through the boy's garbled speech what it was the boy had to say. It was a slow process, this learning to listen. And over the course of a few years, our show-off began to learn how to sing as part of a group. His voice pulled back a bit. He learned how to blend. He learned the beauty of harmony instead of being the standout voice. He learned what it's like not to have to be best all the time. One might say it took him out of his mind to do this. One might say he discovered a kind of ecstasy in being part of the choir instead of just the show-off lead singer. What might it be like for you and me to do that? To stop insisting on always being best and right, and always out front with our opinions that, of course, are the right ones, but to listen. To listen to people we know and to people we don't, to people who are broken, like the boy with the cleft palate, and find perhaps that boy, that one you're listening to, is less broken than you might be, and that broken voices together can make beautiful music. Jim was an eye doctor. He was one of the great eye doctors at the Hopkins in Baltimore. Famous, pursued by people from around the world who wanted their eyes fixed by him. He had accumulated a lot. worldly goods, and a worldly reputation. He and his wife had several children whom they raised, sent to college, and sent out into the world. But just after becoming empty nesters, his wife suddenly died with no warning. He was a member of my first parish, and he came to me shortly after his wife died and said, everything about his life tasted like dust in his mouth. Fame meant nothing. His accumulated worldly goods meant nothing to him. It all was like dust. In that parish, eventually, we decided we were going to open a soup kitchen in downtown Baltimore, far from where the parish was, far from where Dr. Jim lived. And he decided he was going to give up one day a week of his practice to serve sandwiches and soup in the soup kitchen. One might say he had to go out of his mind to do this. And a few years down the road, after serving one day a week in the kitchen, he said to me that his life no longer tasted like dust, but like soup. Shared soup. Shared soup with people he would never have met otherwise. Poor people of the area known as Pigtown in Baltimore. He experienced a new family, a kind of ecstasy, of intimacy with new brothers and sisters. And then there's my friend, really my best friend from high school, whom I'll call Dudley. He was born in the Baltimore equivalent of a suburb like Brookline to two Southern and proud parents with impeccable lineages. And he was proud of his snobbery. I'm not quite sure how we became friends. His opinion was that everything that was wrong with Baltimore could be laid at the feet of black people, whom he hated. He would set his jaw anytime something went wrong in the city and spit out words through pursed lips, accusing them of whatever the present problem was. In our senior years, we were required to do some sort of project outside the school. God alone knows why, and I really mean it that way. God alone knows why Dudley chose to be a tutor in one of the poorest neighborhoods of West Baltimore, entirely African American. One day, he came home from tutoring. I often had dinner at Dudley's house, in fact, more often at his than at mine. And over dinner, he told this story. He said, "Do you know, when I walked into that house today, the first time he'd ever been in his 2T's house, I saw that there were floorboards missing." He said, "You have to be careful where you step or you'll end up in the basement." He said, "Do you know the only source of heat in the house are pots of water on the stove, the gas stove, giving off steam?" He said, "I can't even imagine how cold the second floor must be." A slow going out of his mind began for Dudley then. Dudley and I graduated from high school more than 40 years ago. he's still slowly going out of his mind. He still sometimes purses his lips in accusation of people that he doesn't like. But his life has been slowly transformed, too. His career now is taking abandoned buildings in Baltimore and rehabbing them for indigent people, black, white, Latino, but all poor. And he experiences a kind of ecstasy in his work. He also has a large and new family with no heritage like his own, but perhaps a better heritage. So what might it be like for you and me? Not only to listen to one another, to sing more quietly so that we can hear each other's voice and harmonize with each other, to take whatever is dusty in our mouths and replace it with the food of God, bread and wine that enlivens the taste of everything so that, well, life begins to taste like shared soup with a new family. And what might it take for us to break out of our narrow visions and our accusations and find that our heritage doesn't matter anymore compared to the family we've joined that is bigger and deeper and more full of love and ecstasy than we had ever imagined possible? What might it be like for you to go out of your mind?